The night was cool and quiet in the town of Denton, Maryland, population just under 5,000. On September 18, 1993, 25-year-old Sarah Mitchell stepped outside her small brick house on Maple Street. She told her roommate she was just running to the corner store for milk. The clock read 9:42 p.m. Sarah never came back. When her roommate Jenny walked into the kitchen an hour later, the light above the stove was still on. Sarah's purse sat neatly on the counter. The bed in her room was carefully made, shoes placed side by side. Nothing looked out of order. But Sarah's old green Honda Civic was gone from the driveway, and her keys were missing. Neighbors later told police they saw Sarah walking toward her car, smiling with her hair tied back, wearing a blue sweater. Nobody saw her after that moment. By midnight, Jenny started calling Sarah's phone, but every call went straight to voicemail. At 1:15 a.m., her hands shaking, she dialed 911. Police officers arrived, walked through the quiet home, and felt the same eerie silence Jenny had felt. A young woman had disappeared into the Maryland night, leaving behind only questions. Denton police launched a search as dawn broke on September 19th. Patrol cars drove along back roads, their headlights sweeping over empty fields and tree lines. Officers checked the convenience store Sarah was headed to, but workers said she never arrived. Friends and co-workers described Sarah as warm, dependable, and never reckless. She worked at the local library, loved gardening, and spent evenings helping her grandmother cook. No one believed she would suddenly leave without telling anyone. At 7:14 a.m., Sarah's phone sent its final signal from a tower near Tuckahoe Creek, 3 miles from her house. After that, it went silent forever. Police searched the creek banks, wading through thick mud, scanning the water with flashlights. But no trace of Sarah or her green Honda was found. The house remained spotless, as if frozen in time. Officers noted the uneaten sandwich on the counter, the neat stack of library books by her bed, and the unopened mail on the table. Everything pointed to a young woman who fully intended to come home. By the third day, hundreds of volunteers joined the search. Posters with Sarah's face covered grocery stores, churches, and gas stations. But the days stretched into weeks, and Sarah was still gone. As weeks turned into months, Denton's friendly streets began to feel heavy with fear. Parents told their daughters not to go out at night. Women started locking doors earlier, and everywhere people whispered about Sarah Mitchell. Some said she had a secret boyfriend and left with him. Others believed she had been kidnapped on her way to the store. A few cruel voices even suggested she ran away to escape small-town life. But Sarah's family knew better. Her mother, Grace, stood on the courthouse steps with tears in her eyes and said, "My daughter would never abandon us. Something terrible happened, and someone knows the truth." Police struggled to move forward. They had no car, no clothing, no eyewitnesses beyond a neighbor who only saw Sarah walking toward her driveway. The Tuckahoe Creek search gave no answers, and after 3 months the case slowed. By December 1993, Sarah's disappearance was officially labeled a missing person investigation with no solid leads. For her family, the word missing felt like a cruel pause button. Time moved on, but Sarah's chair at the dinner table stayed empty. And in Denton, the unanswered question grew louder. Where was Sarah? By the start of 1994, the town of Denton still had no answers. Sarah's photo hung in the post office and grocery store, fading from the sun. People passed by it every day, shaking their heads, whispering, "Poor girl." Sarah's family, though, refused to let her case be forgotten. Her brother Michael, only 19 at the time, stapled missing person flyers to telephone poles in nearby towns. He visited gas stations and asked truck drivers if they had seen her green Honda Civic. Some drivers thought they remembered a similar car, but none could be certain. Police kept the case open, but admitted they had no strong leads. Without a crime scene or vehicle, detectives couldn't even be sure whether Sarah had been kidnapped, harmed, or had vanished on her own. Still, her mother's voice echoed through the community. Grace Mitchell said again and again, "She was coming back that night, I know she was. Someone stopped her." The lack of answers ate at everyone. Teenagers told each other ghost stories about Sarah's disappearance. Adults glanced at strangers with suspicion. Denton, once peaceful, carried a shadow now, an unspoken fear that the truth had slipped away forever. By spring of 1994, the case of Sarah Mitchell slowed to a crawl. Detectives filed reports, sealed photographs, and placed the evidence in cardboard boxes labeled with her name. Those boxes were pushed to the back shelves of the Denton Police Department. The official word was clear: no new evidence, no suspects, no progress. Sarah's case was considered cold. For her family, the word felt like betrayal. Grace continued to call the police station weekly, begging for updates. Michael visited the creek again and again, walking the banks with a flashlight, hoping the water might give up its secret. But months stretched into years. By 1996, people in town had stopped talking about Sarah. New families moved in, children grew up, and life moved forward. Yet in the Mitchell house, Sarah's room remained untouched. Her blue sweater still hung on the chair. Her favorite books still sat on the shelf. Grace never gave up. On anniversaries of Sarah's disappearance, she placed flowers by the courthouse steps, reminding everyone that her daughter had not been found. And Michael, now older, began collecting every article, every clipping, every rumor. He promised his mother, "One day I'll bring her home." In 1998, 5 years after Sarah disappeared, Grace decided to take matters into her own hands. She used her savings to hire a private investigator from Baltimore named Richard Hale. He was a retired state trooper, known for being stubborn and relentless. Richard began by reviewing the original police files. He noticed gaps. Several people who lived near the store Sarah was heading to were never formally interviewed. Security cameras from a gas station on the main road were never recovered. Some evidence had simply been overlooked. He drove the route Sarah would have taken, slowly tracing every turn. He spoke to old clerks who still worked at the convenience store. He knocked on doors and asked neighbors what they remembered. Most had little to offer, but one woman recalled hearing the sound of a car door slam around 10 p.m. on Maple Street the night Sarah vanished. She had brushed it off at the time. Richard made careful notes, storing them in thick binders. But even with his persistence, he hit the same wall the police had. No car, no body, no proof. Still, he told Grace something important. Don't stop. Cold cases have a way of thawing. By the early 2000s, Sarah's case had become little more than a fading memory to most of Denton. Children who once saw her posters were now adults. The town grew, new stores opened, and life carried on. But for the Mitchell family, every day was the same, waiting for answers that never came. Michael, now in his late 20s, worked long shifts but never stopped searching. His bedroom was filled with binders and boxes, copies of police reports, hand-drawn maps of possible routes, and notes about rumors he overheard around town. He often drove out to Tuckahoe Creek, standing quietly by the water, convinced his sister's story wasn't finished. Grace's health began to fail, but her hope never wavered. She still believed someone in Denton knew what happened. On some nights, she left the porch light on, whispering, "Come home, Sarah. I'll never stop waiting." But the silence of the case became heavier each year. Detectives retired. Evidence gathered dust. And though Michael begged state police to reopen the file, the answer was always the same. We have no new leads. The mystery of Sarah Mitchell seemed locked in time, unsolvable. In 2015, more than 2 decades after Sarah vanished, a new wave of technology changed how police across the country solved old cases. DNA analysis had become faster and more precise. Databases expanded, linking samples to distant relatives. Cold cases once thought impossible suddenly had hope again. Michael read about these breakthroughs online. He saw news of families reunited with answers after decades. Immediately, he called Maryland State Police and asked if Sarah's case could be re-examined with new forensic tools. At first, the answer was uncertain. Much of the evidence was old, and the car had never been found. But in late 2016, a detective named Claire Donnelly agreed to take a fresh look. She was part of a new cold case unit, determined to revisit forgotten files. Claire pulled Sarah's box of evidence from storage. Inside were faded photographs, copies of phone records, and a sealed bag containing a single item, Sarah's house keys found in her purse on the kitchen counter. They had never been tested with modern methods. For the first time in 20 years, Sarah's case wasn't sitting in the dark. Someone was shining a light on it again. Detective Claire Donnelly worked carefully. She ordered new tests on every scrap of evidence, even items police once thought unimportant. She requested DNA analysis on Sarah's keys, her sweater, and even the envelopes from missing person flyers her family had kept. At the same time, she reopened old witness interviews. She found the woman who had once heard a car door slam the night Sarah vanished. This time, the woman remembered more. She thought she saw a second figure moving near Sarah's car. She hadn't told police because she wasn't sure back then, but after all these years, the memory still lingered. Claire also tracked down Richard Hale, the private investigator Grace had hired in the 1990s. He handed over his old binders, filled with notes and overlooked leads. One page stood out, a report of a man seen near the convenience store that night, loitering in the parking lot, driving a dark pickup truck. Police had dismissed it as irrelevant back then. Now, with new technology and a determined detective, the case of Sarah Mitchell was no longer cold. The puzzle pieces were being pulled back onto the table. There's a pain worse than failure. It's the pain of regret. Failure at least teaches. It sharpens. But regret? It rots. It whispers, you had your chance, and you let it die. The Stoics begged us, never waste the time given, because time is the one thing you can never buy back. Picture this, 10 years from now, standing in front of a mirror. Do you want to see someone who tried and fell, or someone who never moved because fear chained them? Life will give you wounds, yes, but regret leaves scars you cannot heal. And here's the cruel twist. Even the strongest people are broken not by what happened, but by what never happened. So ask yourself tonight, will you live bold and risk the wound of failure, or sit quietly and let regret strangle your future? You think courage feels powerful? It doesn't. It feels terrifying. It feels like your hands shaking and your voice cracking while you move anyway. The Stoics believed courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting while fear screams in your ear. Courage is walking into the interview you think you'll fail. It's confessing love, knowing they may walk away. It's starting the project everyone doubts. Your heart races, your stomach twists, but in that moment you're alive. Because here's the twist. Fear is proof that the moment matters. If you feel nothing, it means nothing. But when fear burns, it means you're standing on the edge of growth. So don't pray for less fear. Pray for more strength to face it. Now ask yourself, when fear knocks tonight, will you hide under the covers or open the door and face it head on? There's a lie we tell ourselves, I'll start tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. The Stoics said, life is lived in the present moment, and the present moment is slipping away with every breath. Every delay is a thief. Every excuse is a chain. You say you'll start when you feel ready, but readiness is an illusion. No one ever feels ready. They just begin. Think of the sound of a clock ticking in an empty room. Each tick is a reminder. Time is leaving, quietly, without asking your permission. And one day the ticking will stop. Not tomorrow, not later. One day, it will stop. That is why the only time you have is now. So I'll ask you one final time in this chapter. Will you keep waiting for the perfect tomorrow, or will you finally believe in yourself enough to start today? The news of Robert Lane's arrest spread across Maryland like wildfire. Denton, once a quiet town where people had almost stopped mentioning Sarah's name, was buzzing again. In the diner, people whispered over coffee cups. At the library where Sarah once worked, staff left flowers near her old desk. Some were shocked that the suspect had lived so close for years, without anyone suspecting him. Others admitted they always felt uneasy about Lane back in the 1990s. He was the type to lose his temper fast, one old co-worker told reporters. Grace, Sarah's mother, broke down when reporters asked how she felt. I prayed every night for answers. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see this day, she said softly. Michael felt torn. He was relieved an arrest had been made, but the thought of his sister's final moments filled him with anger. He wanted the truth, not just a name in handcuffs. The courthouse prepared for what they called a landmark trial. For a town that had waited 25 years, everyone wanted to hear what Robert Lane would say about that September night. As prosecutors built their case, more evidence surfaced. Detectives returned to old storage boxes, rechecking items from the original investigation. On Sarah's blue sweater, they discovered fibers that matched the interior of Lane's pickup truck. Old witness statements, once brushed aside, gained new weight. A man who worked at the gas station in 1993 remembered Lane stopping by that night, looking nervous. Another recalled seeing a green Honda Civic following a dark truck near the road to Tuckahoe Creek. The biggest breakthrough came when police searched Lane's old property records. They found he once rented a small storage unit just months after Sarah vanished. Inside, long abandoned, investigators discovered rusted tools, rope, and scraps of fabric. DNA testing confirmed some of the fabric carried Sarah's genetic material. The pieces of the puzzle were finally fitting together. Prosecutors argued it was proof Lane had lured Sarah away, attacked her, and hidden evidence for decades. For Grace and Michael, every new detail was painful but necessary. The truth was being revealed, layer by layer. In the summer of 2019, Robert Lane stood before a Maryland judge and entered his plea: not guilty. His lawyers claimed the evidence was too old, too damaged, and too weak to prove anything beyond doubt. But prosecutors were ready. They had DNA, fingerprints, and witness testimony tying Lane to Sarah on the night she disappeared. They also revealed a chilling fact. Lane had a history of violence against women, including restraining orders filed in the years after 1993. Reporters from across the state flooded Denton to cover the trial. The small courthouse overflowed with townspeople, many of whom hadn't seen each other in years but came to support Sarah's family. Michael sat in the front row, clutching his sister's favorite book, refusing to look away from Lane. Grace, fragile but determined, whispered prayers under her breath. Everyone waited for the trial to begin, hoping it would finally answer the question that had haunted Denton for more than 2 decades. What really happened to Sarah Mitchell on that September night in 1993? When it was their turn, Lane's lawyers wasted no time attacking the state's case. They argued the DNA evidence was tainted by time, insisting that fibers and fingerprints stored for decades could have been contaminated. They called expert witnesses who explained how heat, humidity, and poor storage might alter results. Then they turned on the witnesses. "Can you honestly remember what you saw on a dark night 25 years ago?" one lawyer pressed the gas station attendant. "Isn't it possible you've convinced yourself of details that never happened?" The defense painted Lane as an ordinary man, a husband and father, not a monster. They showed photos of him at family cookouts, holding his children. The contrast shook some in the courtroom. It was hard to imagine this man committing such a crime. But Michael, watching every second, wasn't fooled. He whispered to himself, "That's the same man who stole my sister." In a surprising move, Robert Lane took the stand in his own defense. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he told the jury he had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. He admitted he knew of her. It's a small town, everyone knew the Mitchells, but denied ever speaking to her. He claimed he was at home the night she vanished, watching TV, though no one could confirm his alibi. When the prosecutor cross-examined, Lane's mask slipped. She asked why his fingerprint was on Sarah's keys if he had never been inside her home. Lane hesitated, then muttered, "I don't know. Maybe the police planted it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even some jurors shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor leaned forward and said, "The truth always leaves traces, Mr. Lane, and yours are all over Sarah Mitchell's life." For the first time, Lane's composure cracked. As the trial dragged into its 3rd week, Denton felt frozen in time again. Every morning, townspeople gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting to hear the latest testimony. Old friends of Sarah's drove in from out of town, carrying photos of her as a reminder of who the case was truly about. Reporters set up cameras outside, broadcasting the story across the state. Inside, the tension was unbearable. Grace grew weaker by the day, but she refused to miss a single session. "I will see this through," she told Michael, gripping his hand. The jury listened silently, their faces unreadable. They had heard the science, the memories, and Lane's shaky denials. Soon, it would be their decision. For Michael, every tick of the courtroom clock felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. After 25 years of waiting, justice for his sister was either about to be delivered or stolen once again. Grace Mitchell grew older, her steps slower, her hair whiter, but her heart lighter than it had been in decades. The weight she once carried, the questions, the sleepless nights, the guilt, had eased since Sarah's case was solved. She often sat on her porch with a blanket watching the sunset. Neighbors who passed would wave and some would stop to chat. They no longer whispered about Sarah, they spoke her name with respect. Grace kept a framed photo of Sarah on her nightstand, along with a pressed flower Sarah had once given her. On quiet evenings she'd whisper, "We've found you, sweetheart. You can rest now." Though her health declined, she was comforted knowing she had lived long enough to see justice for her daughter. Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2021, holding Sarah's photo close. At her funeral, Michael spoke softly. Mum never stopped believing. She carried hope when the rest of the world moved on. Today, I know she's with Sarah, together again after so many years apart. Even after Grace's passing, the story of Sarah Mitchell continued to live on in Denton. Schools told her story during safety awareness programs. The library where she had once worked created a scholarship in her name, helping young women pursue nursing, Sarah's dream before it was stolen. Michael, now older himself, often returned to the river where her car was found. He didn't go to mourn anymore, he went to reflect. Standing by the water, he'd watch the sunlight ripple across the surface and think of Sarah's laughter. Her case became part of Maryland's history, a reminder of persistence, of community, and of how even the deepest secrets could surface after decades. For Michael, Sarah's memory was no longer just tied to loss. It was tied to resilience, love, and the fight for truth. Her story had inspired laws that improved how cold cases were handled across the state. The town had healed, the family had found peace, and the legacy of the final week of the trial began with the prosecution's closing argument, continued to shine brightly as the lead prosecutor stepped forward. This case is about more than evidence. It's about a young woman who never came home. For 25 years, Robert Lane lived his life, while the Mitchell family lived with grief. But the truth never disappears. His fingerprint was on her keys, his DNA was on her sweater, his rope held her captive. You cannot ignore the weight of this evidence. Then the defense had their turn. Lane's attorney paced before the jury. The state wants you to believe old scraps of fabric and fading memories prove guilt. But science isn't perfect, and neither are people. Reasonable doubt is the shield that protects us all. If you have even a shadow of doubt, you must find him not guilty. The jury was left with two pictures, one of a guilty man whose crime was finally exposed, and another of a family man wrongly accused after decades. The jury retired to deliberate. For hours, then days, Denton held its breath. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, filing updates every few minutes. Inside, Grace sat quietly with Michael. She clutched Sarah's necklace in her hand, whispering prayers. Michael paced the hallways, replaying every moment of the trial in his head. On the second day, word spread that the jury had reached a decision. The courthouse filled within minutes. People stood shoulder to shoulder, straining to hear. Michael's heart pounded as he led his mother into the courtroom. Lane sat at the defense table, his face pale but expressionless. The foreman of the jury walked in, holding a folded piece of paper. Everyone knew the next few words would define the rest of their lives. The judge asked the jury for their decision. The room fell so silent that even the shuffle of paper seemed deafening. The foreman read aloud, "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Robert Lane, guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. Grace sobbed, covering her face with trembling hands. Michael exhaled sharply, tears streaming down his cheeks as he gripped his mother's shoulders. Lane sat stone-faced, but for a brief moment his jaw twitched, the only sign of emotion. The judge ordered him taken into custody immediately, sentencing to follow. Outside, church bells rang and people hugged on the courthouse steps. After 25 years of silence, Denton finally had justice for Sarah Mitchell. For Grace, it was bittersweet. She whispered, "We got him, Sarah. We got him." Michael stared at the sky, knowing his promise had been fulfilled. His sister's story had finally reached its end, but her memory would never fade. The weeks after the verdict felt surreal for the Mitchell family. Reporters kept calling, asking for interviews, but Grace preferred silence. For her, the trial had taken every ounce of strength. She spent her days on the porch, the same one where she had once waited for Sarah to come home. Michael found himself restless. For so long, his life had been consumed by chasing leads, begging police, and carrying binders filled with his sister's case. Now that justice had been served, he didn't know what to do with the emptiness left behind. But slowly the family began to heal. Friends and neighbors surrounded them with support. At the library where Sarah once worked, staff set up a small memorial with her photo, her favorite books, and a candle that was kept lit for a month. For the first time in decades, Denton wasn't haunted by whispers of an unsolved mystery. The town felt lighter, as though a shadow had finally lifted. In the fall of 2019, the Mitchell family held a memorial service for Sarah. More than 100 people gathered, friends, classmates, even strangers who had followed her story through the years. Michael spoke at the service. His voice cracked as he looked at the crowd. For 25 years, Sarah's name lived in silence, but she was never forgotten. Today we remember not how she was taken, but how she lived, with kindness, laughter, and love. Grace, fragile but proud, placed Sarah's favorite book of poetry on the altar. She deserved more years, more memories, but she will always be my little girl. And now, she can finally rest. As candles flickered in the evening air, the town of Denton stood together, honoring a life stolen but never erased. The cold case that once felt endless had found its ending. Justice had come, late but strong, and though the pain of loss would never fully leave, Sarah Mitchell's light, her memory, would burn forever in the hearts of those who loved her. After the memorial, Denton felt different. For years, the case had been a wound people avoided speaking about. Now, with the truth revealed, the town could finally talk openly. Some older residents admitted they always felt uneasy walking home at night after Sarah vanished. Parents used her story as a warning to their kids about safety. The arrest of Thomas Reed left many shaken. He had been part of the community, attending barbecues, nodding politely at church, even volunteering once at a local fundraiser. The thought that someone so familiar could hide such darkness made people question how well they knew their neighbors. But the case also inspired change. A new local group called Justice for the Missing was formed by Denton families, pushing for better resources for unsolved cases. They wanted no other family to wait decades for answers. For Michael, this was bittersweet. Sarah's case was finally closed, but he knew many families in Maryland still carried the same heavy silence he had once carried. 1 year after the trial, Michael returned to the courthouse. Not for another case, but for a meeting. He had been invited to speak at a conference for cold case advocacy. Standing at the podium, he held his sister's photo in his hands. He spoke about the pain of waiting, the frustration with unanswered calls, and the way whispers and rumors can wound a grieving family. But he also spoke about hope. "If there's one thing Sarah taught me," he said, "it's to never stop fighting for what matters. I made a promise to her, and to my mother, that I'd never let her name fade. And I won't." The crowd stood and applauded. Among them were detectives, volunteers, and other families of the missing. Michael realized Sarah's story had grown bigger than Denton. It was now a reminder that persistence could bring truth, even after decades. When he walked out of the courthouse, the sky was bright and clear. For the first time, Michael felt peace, not because the pain was gone, but because Sarah's light was finally leading others toward hope. Grace Mitchell grew older, her steps slower, her hair whiter, but her heart lighter than it had been in decades. The weight she once carried, the questions, the sleepless nights, the guilt, had eased since Sarah's case was solved. She often sat on her porch with a blanket watching the sunset. Neighbors who passed would wave and some would stop to chat. They no longer whispered about Sarah, They spoke her name with respect. Grace kept a framed photo of Sarah on her nightstand, along with a pressed flower Sarah had once given her. On quiet evenings, she'd whisper, "We've found you, sweetheart. You can rest now." Though her health declined, she was comforted knowing she had lived long enough to see justice for her daughter. Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2021, holding Sarah's photo close. At her funeral, Michael spoke softly. "Mum never stopped believing. She carried hope when the rest of the world moved on. Today, I know she's with Sarah, together again after so many years apart." Even after Grace's passing, the story of Sarah Mitchell continued to live on in Denton. Schools told her story during safety awareness programs. The library where she had once worked created a scholarship in her name, helping young women pursue nursing, Sarah's dream before it was stolen. Michael, now older himself, often returned to the river where her car was found. He didn't go to mourn anymore, he went to reflect. Standing by the water, he'd watch the sunlight ripple across the surface and think of Sarah's laughter. Her case became part of Maryland's history, a reminder of persistence, of community, and of how even the deepest secrets could surface after decades. For Michael, Sarah's memory was no longer just tied to loss. It was tied to resilience, love, and the fight for truth. Her story had inspired laws that improved how cold cases were handled across the state. The town had healed, the family had found peace, and the legacy of one young woman's life, cut short but never forgotten, continued to shine brightly. As years passed, Michael became a quiet but steady voice for families of the missing. He spoke at town halls, visited schools, and joined panels about cold cases. Though he never sought fame, people listened to him because he carried the pain of experience and the proof that persistence could change everything. He often carried a small binder filled with Sarah's photos, old news clippings, and notes he had kept since the 1990s. He would open it during talks and say, "This is what love looks like when you refuse to give up." His words touched many hearts. Through his advocacy, several other cold cases in Maryland received renewed attention. One family even found closure after 2 decades, thanks to the pressure Michael helped apply. He didn't see himself as a hero, but as a brother keeping a promise. Every December, Michael lit a candle in his window for Sarah. The glow became a tradition across Denton, as neighbors began lighting candles too. Soon, dozens of windows shone with soft light each winter, a symbol of remembrance and hope for all missing loved ones. By the late 2020s, Sarah Mitchell's case was studied in police training sessions across Maryland. Detectives used it as an example of why evidence should never be discarded and why persistence matters. The DNA breakthrough that solved her case became a story of how technology could finally bring answers to families waiting decades. Michael was often invited to these sessions to speak with new officers. He told them about the early days, when police gave up, and how that silence nearly broke his family. He urged them to never underestimate the impact of their words or their inaction. For Denton, Sarah's story was now more than a tragedy. It was a lesson passed down to younger generations. Parents told their children about her kindness, her dreams, and the importance of watching out for one another. Though the pain of her loss never vanished, the legacy of her life had grown into something larger than the town itself. Sarah Mitchell had become a symbol, not of fear, but of courage, faith, and love that refused to fade. 3 decades after Sarah's disappearance, Denton was no longer the same quiet town it once had been. New shops stood on Main Street, children played where old mills once stood, and the river ran calm as if it had never hidden a secret. Yet, Sarah's memory lingered everywhere. A mural of her smiling face decorated the library wall, painted by local students. The yearly candlelight walk in her honor became one of the town's biggest gatherings, drawing not only locals, but people from neighboring cities. Visitors often asked why this one young woman's story had touched so many. The answer was simple: because Sarah could have been anyone's sister, daughter, or friend. Her case reminded everyone that even the smallest towns can hold deep shadows, and that justice, though late, could still be found. Michael grew old with Sarah's photo still by his side. His hair turned grey, his hands stiff, but his heart remained sharp. In interviews, he often said, "I didn't live my life chasing justice. I lived it keeping my sister's memory alive." When he walked the streets of Denton, people greeted him with warmth. Many saw him as the man who carried hope when hope seemed impossible. Some families even named their children Sarah in honor of his sister. On his quiet days, Michael visited his mother's grave and Sarah's memorial stone. He didn't cry as often anymore. Instead, he smiled, remembering the nights Sarah would read poetry out loud, her voice full of dreams. In his later years, Michael wrote a book about Sarah's life and the decades-long fight for answers. He titled it, "The Light That Never Went Out." It wasn't about crime scenes or suspects. It was about love, family, and the power of not letting go. When the book was released, it reached beyond Maryland. Families across the country wrote letters to Michael, thanking him for giving them strength to keep searching for their own missing loved ones. Shortly after the book's release, Michael passed away peacefully in his sleep, just as his mother had years before. At his funeral, candles once again lit up Denton, flickering across every porch, every street, every window. The town said goodbye to the man who never gave up. Today, the name Sarah Mitchell is spoken not only in Denton, but across Maryland. Her story has been told in classrooms, in police academies, in church halls, and on cold winter nights when families light candles in their windows. The tragedy of her loss will never be erased, but neither will the lessons her life and case left behind. That truth can survive silence, that love can outlast years, and that justice, though slow, can still arrive. In Denton, the library still holds her mural. Children who never met Sarah stop to look at her kind smile, asking their parents who she was. The answer is always the same. She was one of us, and she will never be forgotten. The story of Sarah Mitchell, the young woman lost in 1993 and found decades later, will forever remind the world, even in the darkest cases, light can return. Anne.